Greetings, everyone. My name is Chris Albert. I'm with the New Mexico History Museum. We just finished Dr. Babcock's talk on Facebook, and we're expecting a few more visitors coming over from YouTube. That stream of the video should be ending here shortly, so I'm going to hand it over to Ben Woodbury of the Friends of History.
Well, greetings again. This is Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History. I'm here with Professor Babcock, and we'll spend the next 10 or 15 minutes here answering questions which you may have relating to the topic that he has discussed. If you have a question, please type it into the YouTube or preferably on Facebook, since this is running live on Facebook at this point. So, Matt, any comments before we go into the Q&A?
Just wanted to thank both you and Chris so much, and Billy Kaiser as well for the opportunity to give this lecture and share it with friends, family, and colleagues. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Well, I'll go ahead and give off our first question. I was really struck with your presentation in terms of the parallels that were there between the Spanish efforts and how they framed the their reservation program, and how the parallels there were with the U.S. efforts and activities initiating reservations after the Civil War. Any sense on your part as to whether, in fact, the Washington and the military were aware of what the Spanish had done, and perhaps gleaned some of their ideas in terms of how to pursue this?
It's a great question. I don't think U.S. policymakers in Washington or along the eastern seaboard were aware of what the Spanish were doing. But I do think that some of the Indian agents, the U.S. Indian agents in the Southwest were. Specifically, or even the governors. In New Mexico, the Mescalero reservation. There's Governor David Merriweather, and then the Indian agent Michael Steck. Michael Steck was definitely familiar with the Spanish and Mexican efforts to establish reservations for the Apaches, because the Mescaleros and the Mimbres Apaches and some of the Gilas were still traversing back and forth, kind of trying to capitalize on the two systems at the same time. So that's actually, early for the U.S. in the 1850s. But I think in the New Mexico territory in the 1850s, that's where some of the greatest potential for borrowing and overlap would exist.
All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Has anyone come up with a question?
Not currently on the feed, but I do have a question about in the talk. You mentioned how the use and sort of the exhaustion of the resources and supplies that the Apache that the Spanish had provided the Apache with. Could you? I wondered if that was an intentional, maybe political act on their part, or could you talk to
Sure.
maybe how that was? You mentioned the Spanish were surprised at how quickly all those resources were used up. I'm wondering about how the Apaches looked at that and how they dealt with that consumption.
Yeah, it's a great question and something that I was fascinated by. So, there are different things going on. Even if the Apaches aren't trying to game the system, just based on the increase in numbers of Apaches de Paz as the decade of the 1790s rose, there was more and more pressure on Spaniards to provide the rations and gifts for all these people. And then, when you combine things like drought, and then just the savviness of Apaches, I refer to some of their savviness in the gambling, but they were also savvy in trying to extract as many rations as possible. In some cases, they're claiming additional rations for people that are dozens of miles away from the actual post. And aside from those two things, the increasing numbers, the ability of certain Apache leaders to try to game the system, you also had cultural differences where, in terms of providing livestock for ranching, I mean that just was seemingly never going to work. That Apache Nantans or chiefs would kill a bison or kill cattle, and if the bison wasn't available, and redistribute that, or horses or whatever it was, they would then redistribute that to increase their prestige. And oftentimes, steers are provided for ranching, and there's a shortage of rations, and they're simply killing those animals and consuming them. Apaches did eat a lot of horse and cattle meat, and so that cultural difference was also a huge issue. So there are a number of factors coming together. I mean, with the drought, even without a drought, you kind of have to move to survive off the land. It's just, it looks good from a Spanish perspective in terms of numbers when you have 2,000 Apaches at peace at a given presidio. But if you think about the practical nature of feeding all those people, especially when rations are in short supply, the Apaches are going to have to move just in order to survive off the land and not exhaust the resources.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have one other question, and that has to do in terms of what is your sense in terms of the timing of the Spanish initiative to set up these centers? What were the factors at play that led them to want to try this experiment, which was at this particular time? There are in any parallels with earlier efforts in terms of settling and trying to keep the peace in New Mexico territory. Sure.
I probably could have provided more context on that. There's a major reform in Spanish Indian policy that Viceroy Bernardo de Galvez in 1786 issues instructions making Spanish Indian policy a little bit more like what we think of in terms of the French doing, with trading more with the Indians and religious conversion. It's not that they hadn't tried that before, but the Spanish military was much harsher through most of the 1770s and 1780s. So why did the Spanish do that? I mean, well, you've got the Bourbon reforms over in Europe and ruling in Spain, and so there's more overlap between French and Spanish policy making. But there's also some costly foreign wars that are going on. The Spaniards were under the impression that this was going to be a cost-saving measure, that by making all these peace agreements with the Indians, it would be less costly than making war against them. You have that a bad peace better than a good war phrase from Bernardo de Galvez's instructions. And so, it's interesting. I mean, in comparison to U.S. policy, when the U.S.-Mexican War is going on, and then also when the Civil War is going on, the United States is similarly distracted, and it's not just a linear decline for Indians in the U.S. period either, and Indian leaders, were shocked to see all these troops leaving, in the early 1860s during the Civil War, and they thought that it was, that they were responsible for those departures, and they were emboldened during the Civil War years, and then the U.S. had to make up some lost ground again once the Civil War ended. So, there are definitely similarities in terms of ebbs and flows between peaceful policies and more militaristic policies between the Spanish and the United States, and the drought. That's also an important factor. Why are Apaches going to even consider farming at all? That's where the drought, makes that much more potentially feasible.
Good point with that. Chris, any questions on the chat?
Thus far, no.
Okay. One last more of an observation, which you might want to comment on, is I was just struck with one of your conclusions, in that you pointed out that actually this period of support from the Spanish provided an opportunity ultimately for the Apaches who are suffering a decline to kind of regain some of their strength and provide a framework which may have ultimately contributed to the strengthening of the tribes, and of course would have had an impact during the Apache Wars that the Americans were fighting after the Civil War.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Because I feel like there's this forgotten cycle of partial incorporation, and partial acculturation of Apaches in the period of this talk, and that fits in with the title of Blurred Borders. But you're right. Then the Apaches returned to their homeland, and really it's some of the first American settlers, first Anglo-American settlers coming in the 1830s and 1840s that are somewhat confused, thinking that because the Apaches seem so powerful and are conducting so many raids, they assume that they'd just been running roughshod over the region from the beginning. And again, we can see that's not the case. That the Spaniards were formidable militarily, and they didn't begin fighting with Indian tactics very well, but by this period they'd really adapted. They were sending they were utilizing Indian scouts. I mean, as U.S. troops would later do, and hunting down families in their own territory, and capturing a lot of women and children. But yes, I don't think that we would look at this overall system of reservations and say that overall, just because not of a lot of Apaches became sedentary Catholic farmers the way Spaniards hoped that it was a failure. I think we would, and as many settlers, many Norteño settlers did, they looked at the reduction in violence in overall rating during this period, and looked back on it fondly as a period of partial peace. But yeah, the U.S. military clearly after 1848, they have what looks like half of Mexico's territory on paper, but in reality, Apaches, Comanches, and Navajos control large portions of that territory, and they have a whole new problem on their hands.
So, Matt, I want to thank you. Then I think we'll tie up the loose ends at this point. Okay. Great discussion. Much appreciate your being able to continue the dialogue. And I want to thank you personally on behalf of the Friends of History and the History Museum for your participation in the first Wednesday lectures. And we look forward to seeing your analysis as in the future.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Right. It's been a pleasure. All right, then. Take care.
Take care.